I'm basically here to kind of talk more about the how, because I think a lot of people here already understand we need naturalistic processes, we need scale, we live in a nature-depleted country, we know all that. The question is, how do we scale nature restoration so that everybody can participate, but with a particular focus upon the acres that we need to rebuild populations of species, not just individual isolated pockets of nature, which is what we often have in the UK at the moment. So when I started writing Rebirding, I started off writing a book about the decline of birds in sort of modern times, since the 1970s, the 1960s, these kind of slightly arbitrary baselines that we set ourselves as if before 1969, when the first bird atlas was written, everything was perfect. And of course, as you begin to look into it, you realise that the de-wilding of the United Kingdom is a 10,000 plus year story, and in this country is a particularly sorry tale that involves many entirely pointless eradications of choughs, of white-tailed eagles, of hedgehogs for bizarre spiritual reasons, and all kinds of disappointing stuff that makes you feel very unproud to be British. It gets more positive in a minute. So basically, I found myself writing a book that actually wanted to go right back to the beginning, which I won't do today because we don't have enough time, of how the UK was de-wilded, because I thought if we want to re-wild it or restore it, we need to know what went so cataclysmically wrong and continues to go wrong today. We have more red-listed birds in free fall than France, Germany. We're behind massively, in spite of the enormous dichotomy that we have, more people per capita interested in nature restoration. We arguably have the most well-funded nature restoration sector in the UK when you combine the increasing firepower of your Nattergals and Restores and Oxygens with, of course, amazing organisations from the RSPB to Rewilding Britain. And yet we find ourselves with this extraordinary paucity of wildlife that continues to remorselessly bleed out of the countryside, whether that's cuckoos, nightingales. You know, we don't necessarily need wolves back tomorrow, emphasis on tomorrow, but it would be very good to think we could at least have a countryside that is amenable enough that all of us can go out and hear a turtle dove in the morning without having to get in the car and drive the best part of 100 miles, which is what I have to do in a first world country to hear a turtle dove, and that is frankly a mess. So the premise that I kind of set out in Rebirding, which very much permeates the work that we do at Restore, is the food chain has collapsed. We are in a state of complete and utter trophic collapse, where dung beetles, bees, the butterflies that spotted flycatchers feed on, the very basis of the food chain, the woolly caterpillars that really underpin the life cycle of the cuckoo as much as its hosts and famous parasitic lifestyle. We have ripped the very heart out of the countryside. We have destroyed the food chain. So when we come to the how of Rewilding Britain, obviously an enormous focus on these charismatic species, wolf, elk, that can regulate systems from the top down. And I've always believed that actually it's equally important to rebuild these systems from the bottom up. Because if birds don't have enough to eat and are falling off their perches, that is something your average farmer could do something about. We don't necessarily need to be restoring vast Yellowstones all over the place. We hear Britain's a crowded country, parts of it are very crowded. The Scottish Highlands, there are areas with a population density lower than Montana, which I know Sarah was touching on in that talk, is we do have the space for Yellowstones and the Cairngorms, but we also need more scalable solutions for rebuilding the trophic collapse in the countryside. And it's still very clear to me when I go to any farm and estate, the key problem is that the food chain, whether that's use of ivermectins taking out the dung beetles, whether that's the simplification of the landscape, whether that's the use of so many fertilizers that the land itself has become buried in what I call triffid grassland. We are dealing with a trophic collapse that needs to be reconstructed as carefully as heart surgery. It's very difficult and it's very time consuming. And a lot of rewilding projects, I think, do focus on the big and the sexy, and it's a brilliant way of bringing people into the space. But what we actually need to do is also be rebuilding systems from the bottom up with a critical focus on soil, on floral diversity, on invertebrates, on enrichment, on all of these perhaps more granular things that then allow us to reconstruct whole ecosystems and really begin to scale what we're doing. So that was one of the key things. The other one, of course, is the loss of natural processes. We had a bit of a weird de-wilding history in the UK. We got rid of the original herbivores very early on, but prior to the widespread enclosure of farming in the 1700s, we ended up with a kind of lightly farmed Serengeti full of wrynecks and corncrakes and wood pasture, and a lot of habitats that would have emulated the original habitats. So if you go to Spain, if you go to areas of Portugal, particularly the hilly areas of the Picos de Europa, it's difficult to look at it and think that it's that much different from the days of the straight-tusked elephants and the narrow-nosed rhinoceros, because it is this kind of broken, chaotic, scrubby, mosaic landscape. And anyone knows that a dark, straight, dank wood is actually not a particularly good habitat on the one hand, and a very, very open landscape. And we've obsessed, including Natural England, with open landscapes in the UK, particularly in the uplands, is equally limiting for a whole range of species. The vast majority of life thrives at that interface of chaos and vegetation succession, herbivory, these naturalistic processes with us being allowed to do what they want, and of course the critical interface of species against time. So when you go to eastern Poland, you'll see what looks like a golf course, which it would be in England, and it's a river valley in winter where the water is slowly receding, and as it is receding, it is creating habitats that are not fixed in time or space. They move, and the birds move with them, the white-winged terns, the corncrakes, everything picks its moment within that ecosystem. Which is why our obsession with habitat fixity, which I know is George Monbiot's big bugbear, but it's kind of one of mine too, is that we can't be locking nature into statements, triple SIs, small areas. And whenever we try and do that, it generally gives us a great big clucking hint that it doesn't like those habitats by going extinct a very short time later. So we need to be looking at landscape level habitat change. We need to be looking at scale. We set up Restore to deal with scale. We don't need more small nature reserves or medium-sized nature reserves. We need our farmland to be full of life. It can't all be rewilded. We do need to eat food, although the rewilding food dichotomy is greatly exaggerated. 1% of our diet is lamb, 88% of Wales is given over to it. So there are all kinds of enormous ratios of wasted space here in the UK, which I think many of you are probably already aware of. So the question then we faced with Restore when we set it up is, how do we scale to hundreds of thousands of acres of land that is at least trophically diverse, heterogeneous, highly varied, and large enough for populations of invertebrates, populations of birds, cuckoos, for example, need an area the size of the New Forest to sustain one population. In all the areas where you don't have a big population of cuckoos, you have no cuckoos. Nature is very bad in the middle. It either tends to do really well, or you have something called functional extinction, whereby you believe that the species is still surviving, like willow tit, lesser spotted woodpecker, and suddenly it just goes off a cliff edge because the scale of habitat that you thought it needed isn't what it thought it needed. So the question then was, how do we scale? There are kind of two main options when you're looking at rewilding and putting it into practice, so beyond policy into actually transforming the land. Option one is you buy the land. That ostensibly, if you set aside costs, seems a sensible thing to do, which is why Nattergal are doing it, Oxygen are doing it, and it is very exciting to see Oxygen Conservation buying, landscapes like grouse moors that have really been written off for a very few people becoming landscapes that are there for the much wider community. It is increasingly easy to find significant quantities of capital to do this using natural capital markets, and we may consider doing it in the future. But we were much more interested in thought leadership, and our key product as a limited company, as a business, is actually vision. Because it occurred to us the only way you really scale farm clusters, big estates, the only way you turn hunting estates and shooting estates so they and the gamekeeper, and this is a real example, is phoning me up asking when the beavers are going in, is by thought leadership and by vision. And unless you can present somebody with a very compelling reason to do something differently, without offending them too much in the process that what they're currently doing may not be optimal for nature, to coin an understatement, then we're not going to be able to scale nature restoration, because we'll have a lot of people, including many of the people in this room, who already know this is a good idea. You'll have the idea, then eventually the idea has to translate into land that is restored or fully rewilded, and we need hundreds of thousands of acres of trophically rich landscapes if we're even going to begin to arrest nature decline, let alone begin to restore replete ecosystems. So we tried to develop a model, and I say tried because this is an ongoing journey with setbacks, as you might expect, but it has been broadly successful, is to scale nature restoration to 76,000 acres, I believe, at the moment, by having a vision that can be repeated, a vision that is scalable. And the vision is ostensibly not that complicated. It's vision, finance, implementation and baselining, and then in doing so, unlocking the natural capital, the biodiversity net gain, the carbon, the longer term returns that make nature restoration viable. You will find hundreds of, probably I would say thousands of farmers across the UK who are sick and tired of doing what they're doing. And they know what you know, which is that their land is ecologically degraded, that they don't have the curlews that their grandfather remembers. They know this already. Some are in denial, they're very large voices like the NFU that actually don't represent anywhere near as many farmers as we may think. But there's a whole tranche of, I think, millions of acres of the British countryside whose landowners, farmers, farm clusters are aware that things have gone spectacularly wrong. Because ultimately, when you collapse nature to the scale we've collapsed it, it isn't just about ecosystem restoration. People will not be able to farm. And we're having people coming to us who have, by their own admission, knackered the land so much that they cannot farm it productively. And I don't mean productively in terms of just pour more inputs into it and hope for the best. I mean a productive system like the Spanish Dehesa, like wood pasture, that can continue to produce high quality, low intensity food for many years to come. So a lot of our work is embedding on estates, weirdly, much more in a sort of land agent capacity, but a land agent that delivers ecological change. Delivering the vision of what that land could look like, and painting that picture very vividly with photos from real landscapes. So if we're doing a peatland restoration program, people in this country are obsessed with the concept of treeless peatland. If you go to Estonia, I mean, nobody's told the trees. It's full of dwarf birch and willow, and it's a highly complex landscape with blue throats, and you'll see wading birds singing off the tops of trees. But if you don't know that's what a peatland is supposed to look like, how on earth are you ever going to restore one? But of course, it's similar for much more straightforward things like farms. If a farmer has forgotten, because, say, their grandparents have passed away, what the farm looked like or sounded like, even 50 years ago, 100 years ago, what's missing, the layers, the complexity, the featheriness you get in landscapes where deer, which used to die off, well, obviously originally because of predation by apex predators and then because of cold winters, and now southern England, most of our sites are completely overrun, and I use the word advisedly, by deer, including non-native deer. People have forgotten that woodlands are supposed to be full of flowers and scrub. And over time, we get shifting baselines. People have forgotten that field edges are supposed to be chaotic. People have forgotten that normally when you leave a bit of earth in farmland in Eastern Europe, it stays in a very low sward way that's very beneficial for turtle doves. When you leave land in farmland in the UK, you get this whoosh of vegetation because of the enrichment that's poured into that landscape or historically remains in that landscape. But it's very difficult for most of our clients to actually know what they're aiming for. So one of the key parts of Restore is to start with vision, to go, right, this is where we think you can get. We want to get you all the way towards, a grouse moor that's no longer a grouse moor with beavers and wild habitats. But we have to accept there are a whole series of intermediary stages before we can get to that exciting reality. Lots of our landowners are committed enough that they may want to dip their toe in the water. They may want to take 500 acres into nature restoration if they've got a big 5,000 acre estate. We get some who are so fed up with intensively knackering the land, they want to go all the way straight away. But we also kind of specialise in farmers who don't want to rewild, which is actually, I think, an informal word, by which I mean they don't want to restore an 1,000 acre farm to complex ecological process driven restoration. They want to continue farming. But they want to continue farming very much in the way that we farmed in the 1900s. So they want to be surrounded by life. So this is our clientele. And the clientele keeps on approaching us, which is great. We don't really have a marketing strategy because there are so many people who are realizing that the only way to get themselves out of the mess that they're in owning land, financial, social, cultural, intergenerational, and ecological, is nature restoration. There is no other option unless they're going to turn it into a car park, unless they're going to get very lucky, they've got lots of real estate and they can turn it into a wedding facility. If you own an upland estate at the moment, you are pretty much financially stuffed. You've got some people with deep enough pockets, they want to continue just pouring their money into driven grouse shooting. Sure, and that will last another 10 years until the red grouse continues moving north for climate change. And then they'll wonder why they didn't jump ship earlier. So we've got a lot of early adopters and early pioneers. Our first client had already put beavers on their land by the time they got in touch. So we have some clients who are completely aligned. But often you'll find that the biggest stumbling block is the finance. I'm not going to go into too much detail on natural capital because it is a very well covered topic. We believe that 90% of natural capital deals are hot air and made up, and our job is to deliver the 10% that deliver real finance into the farmer or landowner's bank account. Otherwise, we're not selling natural capital, we're selling something that we can't deliver. We've been very lucky to be joined by Gil Martin, the visionary behind the Belmont Estate Rewilding project. And we see things like biodiversity net gain and carbon. They're not the end, they're just a means. And if the means changes, if we could pay our landowners in Mars bars, then we do it. We'd much prefer Mars bars to carbon. But at the moment, we are using the available means, and we are stacking a range of different income streams to make sure that we have a diversified farm. And we always behave as if the farm was ours, it was our only asset. And we try and a few better clients, treat them with a lot of care, and make sure above all that we have a financial plan A, B, C, D, E. Now, normally, even within 10 minutes of modelling the economics of an intensive arable farm in Wiltshire versus the economics of nature restoration, it takes about 10 minutes to demonstrate at a macro level that nature restoration is the more profitable option. It is quite stark, because with arable farming that is intensive, which most of it in the UK is, regardless of the terrible knock-ons for our microbiome, or is that the food we should be eating, that's a conversation for another day. But fundamentally, a lot of farmers are starting with a bank balance of minus £700,000 for a big farm because of the inputs. So the first thing to do is take the inputs out. Now if it was that easy, it would be that easy. So often what we find is almost like a drug taker. The land has become entirely dependent upon, and the farmers have become entirely dependent upon glyphosate. All of these things the NFU keep telling us that farmers need and the big companies keep selling. Well, how did we farm productively from the Neolithic to about 1960 if we needed glyphosate? How do we have this amazing, and it is amazing, cultural legacy of livestock farming if the lambs of the 1600s or cattle needed ivermectins? It's all complete and utter shit. So a lot of what we do, and particularly our farm nature manager Ross, is the journey doesn't always begin diving in. It will always begin with vision. There'll always be, often our clients will take 7-8 months to actually decide whether our vision is right for them. And if they decide that it isn't right for them, that's fine, because doing nature restoration is incredibly labour intensive. We've seen a lot of romanticisation of amazing projects like NEP. And I think we do encounter landowners who think you can just pick up a NEP estate and move it across the country and plonk it somewhere else. Well, of course, every land is on a different journey, and every landscape is ecologically buggered to a different level. So often we'll find that we'll be spending years doing quite thankless tasks like trying to reset soil nutrient levels, because if you don't do that, all you get is the same few species coming up again and again. You can plant whatever you want, the dominant grasses will take over. And you begin to realise that actually a lot of the obstacles to nature restoration when you're doing it are not the ones that you thought when you were writing books or at the earlier stage of thinking it was a good idea. So who'd have thought that dealing with the Forestry Commission, I hate to single out an organisation, would be the thing that I wake up in a cold sweat at 2 o'clock in the morning thinking about. A lot of our clients have forestry plantations from the 60s or 70s of Corsican pine, of Sitka spruce, that are entirely ecologically useless. And it will be much better, instead of pretending that they're ecologically beneficial, to accept our proposal to clear fell and start again. That is a bureaucratic nightmare. People always rant about natural England, and I have to say that our experiences thus far have been fairly positive. But there was a huge amount of stakeholder engagement, as I know has been covered already, needed to bring this together. But I would just say that without farmers, without large landowners, and without scale, nothing that we seek to achieve or want to achieve is going to come to fruition. But we are at a very exciting time now, and I just end on one thought. When I came to this conference, 20-something, 19 I think, there was no Nattergal, there was no oxygen conservation, there was no restore, there were ideas. There are now happily competing businesses. There are now hundreds of landowners pursuing those organisations, and nature restoration is now so successful it can be run as a business that effectively allows it to be normalised. And this is what we're trying to do. Whilst elk are special, while each of our encounters with nature is special, nature restoration has to be normalised, and the journey starts here. Thanks for listening.